Continuing along with the Eightfold Path, I will try to speak about right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Often in meditation retreats, those are left out. Those are kind of general discussions. But since the retreat is on the 37 Requisites of Enlightenment, we will include the speech, action, and livelihood as well. It is kind of like the Vinaya is for monks. Monks need to refresh themselves every now and then, just go over the rules. We sit down together once every 2 weeks on the full moon and new moon, and somebody recites the summary of the rules called the Patimokkha. And before that happens, if you've made any transgressions, you confess to another monk. So it's just skillful teachings. The Buddha gives little structures for you to remind yourselves of what you're committed to. The Patimokkha, the Vinaya, are mostly about behavioral matters, even down to the slight things like whether you smack your lips when you're eating with your fellow monks, you make the chapu chapu sound, or when you drink, you make the suru suru sound, the slurpy slurpy sound. You drive your fellow monks out of their minds. You have to sit beside that monk for 10 years. So Buddha is very considerate. He says, now the high standards of etiquette and, of course, speech. And there's many considerations for right speech. The basics for in the lay life, these 4 aspects of right speech are very lofty considering the level of speech that goes on these days. It's wild. And of course, we have access to this through media. It used to be just radios, and then there was televisions, and then it exploded into the internet. And now it's everywhere. Millions of people talking to each other, and you're able to access it. And it's good to go back to the basics of right speech to help you also judge what you should be, how you should evaluate people who are speaking. People, sometimes you like their demeanor, or they're on your side, on the same page as you in certain aspects, so you let slide some of the coarser types of language and speech. But it is good to know that right speech is the nature of the it's an Arya nature, a noble person, dignified, ethical, moral person holds these standards of speech. Lots of people are persuaded by charisma, etc., but one should analyze and ask oneself, speech that's being uttered, does it first of all violate this basic one, false speech and full awareness? Aside from, so in the Noble Eightfold Path, there's the 4 categories of speech: false speech, harsh speech, malicious speech, and frivolous speech. And there's another way of examining speech as well, and which the Buddha gives a little matrix for it, about his own considerations about speech. First of all, is it in accordance with the facts? So, if it is not true, then he does not say it. So the first requirement is that it's true. The second requirement is that it's beneficial. So he just doesn't just say anything because it's true. There are people who blurt out all kinds of things, and it may be true and they think it's true, but it's not the only criteria for speaking. So the next criteria is it beneficial? So, you have to assess the person you're talking to or the audience you're talking to. Is this some blunt truth going to benefit them or not? If it is not true and beneficial, the Buddha says, I do not say it. And then there's another category. Is it pleasant or unpleasant to hear? So something might be true and beneficial, but it's going to be unpleasant to hear. And he says, if it's true and beneficial and unpleasant, what? I say it. Yes, sometimes it is, the person doesn't want to hear it, but they need to hear it. It's true and beneficial. So even though it's unpleasant, he says it. And if it's pleasant, he also says it. So it's not, you don't want it just be true, beneficial, and unpleasant. So both of those it's okay, as long as it's true and beneficial, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, I say it. I mean, even between monks, monk confesses something or does something, and you're obliged to say something sometimes if they're outside the Vinaya or inappropriate, and they may not like it, but one can go ahead and say it. There's also consideration for the monks in correcting another, and this is part of skillful speech, and that is you first ask yourself, do I speak in accordance with the facts? So when you're evaluating somebody else's behavior, criticizing somebody else's behavior, there may be a tendency to exaggerate the problem or the fault and so forth. You have to say, now, am I dramatizing this? Am I exaggerating this? You go over just the plain basis of the facts. And then one says, am I myself free from this fault? So they tend to not close the door properly, and you find the door one day wide open, and you think, that fool, he's done it again. He's left the door open. And you realize it was you. You did it. So you got to work on your door closing technique before you lay it on brother so-and-so. So you have to, and quite often that's the case. We have work to do, so don't bother correcting everybody else. If you got your own work to do, straighten that out. Then, do I speak with a heart of loving kindness, or at least, a heart that sounds extreme, loving kindness, but am I friendly? I mean, I'm looking to help this person, not just to criticize that person, to get it off my chest. What are my motives here? What is the spirit that I speak in? And quite often, I mean, if the tone of your voice is friendly, the person can hear it quite often, and they'll accept it. But if they feel there's hostility behind it, then they may be very resistant. So this is the criteria which is advised by the Buddha for monks correcting each other. So you can also use that in regular life. as a little checklist before one is correcting another. But primarily, so in the list for the Eightfold Path, which is also the list for the precepts, it's not to speak falsely in full awareness. Because it's not just falsely, because you can easily think that something's true and say it, and it turns out later it's not true. But that's not false speech in full awareness. In other words, lying. Lying, the word lying is thrown around quite a bit these days. So-and-so's lying, so-and-so's lying. Sometimes they are. They're deliberately speaking in full awareness that what they're saying is false. But others they have agendas and so forth, but they're actually convinced of it, and they're also convinced of that it's true. So they're not lying. They're just wrong. They're misinformed. So that's a very easy thing for humans to be. But we should be somewhat concerned about our facts as much as we can be. But even all kinds of strongly held community facts, even scientific facts, turn out to be wrong. 15 years later, another element is added to the observations, and it turns out that the assessment about what electrons do, it turned out to be false. It's not that way. So we commonly realize that when more information comes in, we might change our minds, but we're not uttering false speech in full awareness. There's also like hasty speech. You tell a story that later on you think, well, it wasn't exactly that way. You suddenly realize, oh yeah, right, so you skipped over a part or made it a little more colorful or something like that. That's not fully conscious. You're not fully conscious about that. You can also turn this kind of speech inward. How do you speak to yourself? And do you tell yourself lies? Do you lie to yourself? You can also evaluate your speech to yourself as, do I speak with a heart of loving kindness to myself? So that's a very common thing, is to speak. One can be quite gentle with others and supportive and understanding of their faults, but when it comes to you, it's the opposite, a very harsh, hypercritical mind. And quite often with people, they come in and tell me about their faults and how they think. It's pervasive in this society. Very harsh self-assessments, very critical of themselves, very negative towards themselves. I don't know what's going on, but it's just pervasive. And this is not the approach the Buddha had, that you have an obligation to be kind, not only to others, but to yourself. Metta, loving kindness, friendliness, should actually be prioritized to oneself. Of all people, you need to be your best friend, And to ask yourself whether you're exaggerating, because people I have telling me all these faults, I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, that's ridiculous. You're very smart. You're not stupid. You're very smart. You've got talents, you've got abilities. Much better than the average person, and this person is just so critical and just has a very distorted, bad view of themselves. So that is something that you can use as part of right speech, because you're actually speaking, you're talking to yourself discursive activity. Under right intention, we talked about that the other night. Right intention, non-ill will, non-cruelty, and renunciation. Those are intentions, and they can be behind actions and behind speech. But when we have discursive inner speech, we're actually muttering to ourselves. We're talking to ourselves, you idiot, this kind of talk. Of course, you can also go in the opposite direction and have this narcissistic idea of that you're perfect and you're absolutely not seeing what's real in the mirror. That the mirror is one of the ways the Buddha talks about self-assessment, is like he's even talking about the assessment of yourself as, are you a sotapanna? Have you attained the first stage of enlightenment? And he gives this sutta called the Mirror of Dhamma, in which, so he's not around to tell you. So in the good old days when the Buddha is around, he's saying this person's a sotapanna, this person's second stage, third stage, fourth stage, there's an arahant. So-and-so thinks they're enlightened, but they're not. This one doesn't think they're enlightened, but they are. So I'm going to leave you with this mirror of Dhamma, which is how to assess yourself. You look into it and see what's reflected back. And it won't work if you exaggerate or prevaricate. The mirror can't be a distorted mirror. It can't be one of those funhouse mirrors. Now you see this in some of the psychology tests. People are asked to tune the mirror. It's a mirror that can be adjusted, and if they have an image of themselves as fat, they tune it until it looks fat. And then if they have an image that they're slender, they turn it to slender. They actually see themselves this way, totally distortion. And then they undo the thing, put it back to its flat surface. They see as it really is. And we have to be wary. Are we turning this? Are we distorting this? We're exaggerating certain things. The only self-assessment we're going to get. So one of the self-assessments is, am I have the integrity of the precepts? So that's the nature of the Sotapanna, is concerned with ethics, morals. And one of those is right speech. How do I speak? Am I honest in my speech? Do I speak beneficially? Etc. So, right speech is a very important factor. And as I say, even in a silent retreat, quite often these retreats they advocate noble silence, which noble silence means silence of the mind, actually. It's not just not speaking. And noble silence it's rather high demand. That's why I don't insist that you take noble silence during this retreat. Because noble silence really is the second jhana. You stop talking. So it's just one of these things that people say. But you'll be talking to yourself through the retreat, And but heightened awareness of the nature of the inner chat, the monologue. Occasionally it's a dialogue as well. There's two of you talking to each other. So the next one is harsh speech, and that again is strong critical language, swearing at somebody, shouting, exaggerating faults about them, calling them idiots and so forth. So this is this is something to work with. There's such, the level of speech in my life. What could be said on public media before, like in the 60s, is just staggeringly different than what is allowed to be said now. So there's been a loosening up, kind of an advocacy of freedom to say these things, but actually it went off the track. And now you can see that there's an attempt to rein it in as well. And everybody's, if they're raised in a certain time period or under a certain standard, they're shocked that you can't say that anymore. But these are standards of speech that kind of got out of hand. And it's good to go to to find a transcultural basis for speech, because in the midst of all of this social attempt to decide, well, what can you say, what can't you say, and how come you can't say that, and why shouldn't you say that, you can step right out of this whole time mess and go to another culture in a different time, and they also dealt with this, and you can get views on speech from very refined individuals, very intelligent, socially sensitive, in other words, the Buddha. It helps you clarify, get a bigger view of things. So this harsh speech should be abandoned. And it's sometimes difficult in the midst of, it's easier for monastics in the monastery, but out there, there's the office kind of banter and tone and locker room talk and pub talk and all this kind of stuff. So you can be kind of dragged into it. But nevertheless, you have to make a decision that you're not going to participate in that way. So you have to practice that and establish that. And it's good, of course, and you listen to Dhamma talks about right speech and see what it is, because it's not easy to just come up with on your own. Lots of people would say, well, harsh speech is justified if the guy's an idiot, you call him an idiot, right? So it's like, you have to do that, don't you? Otherwise they don't understand. So you have to kind of reflect on it and decide where the line is. Explore it for yourself. Malicious speech, and this is a very big one these days in the political arena, is taking the faults of this person and reporting it to that person, in hoping to divide them. It's a divisive speech. Trying to divide people. A very great sort of karmic negative is dividing a community that's in harmony. So this is one of the great no-nos in the Sangha itself. This is causing a schism, a division in the Sangha is right up there with killing your parents. It's about as bad as it gets. Killing an arahant, wounding the Buddha, causing a schism, attempting to divide the Sangha. The Sangha survives by harmony, and the Buddha is endlessly on about this. Watch your speech, monks. Don't be too rigid about this. The idea is to get along. There are moral standards, but it's not just following rules. There's got to be goodwill behind it and a determination to make this thing work. So don't just be walking around with excessive rule following without the goodwill that's necessary behind it. Notice the correction of for monks correcting another monk. Do I speak in accord with the rules? Is it in accord with the facts? But that's not enough. Do I speak with goodwill? You know? And before I get into it, have I corrected my own behavior? So there's an attitude behind this. And that malicious attitude, divisive attitude, is also out there. Particularly this pandemic thing, this is a unusual event. It happens every 100 years or so, a worldwide pandemic or something, but you can see whoever has to make decisions, try to get this thing, it's obviously, you're trying to get an immense community of people, billions of people, to sort of cooperate. And then there's all kinds of people who don't want to cooperate, would like to make a problem. And then there's speech is wild, no checking with the facts, etc. This happens with politics, it happens with businesses, it happens in families, happens in community level things. There's got to be, the only way this thing works, whole societies, empires collapse, and it's because of this lack of goodwill and the will to follow these kind of guidelines. I think the longest enduring empire in history is the Byzantium Empire, which most people don't even know what existed. It's 700 years. The Roman Empire is less than that. Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, Egyptian Empire. No, they don't last that long. They start to fall apart from within, etc. So, and it's because of this decline. The Buddha talks about this decline of those basic ideas. This is attitude. Families fall apart. Friendships fall apart. All of this decline because one is not aware of these basic guidelines, and they need to reflect on those. And so people, of course, are not agreed on these things. But if you've found your way to the Buddhist community, then hopefully you get to reflect on these, or listen to talks on it, read the suttas yourself on the nature of right speech. And it's quite beautiful. It's different than the rules of the game out in the world. So you're left with this problem. You gotta follow more lofty rules in a world that doesn't follow your rules. So that's a challenge itself. The last of these is frivolous speech. And that is just, the rest of the media is just babble, just filling the air, just shooting the breeze, this and that, nothing particularly meaningful, more or less pointless speech. The Pali word for this is sampapalapa. Says it all. It's a blah, 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 blah. This is incredible onomatopoeia. Yes, sampapalapa. It's hard to say, where is the line with frivolous speech? It's not about saying, oh, isn't it a lovely day, or good morning, how are you, and this kind of stuff. That's social lubrication, helps things go, a little something. It's not frivolous. It has a point to it, but just babbling on about what you saw on TV the other day, and on to the next, just filling the air, is one of the ways you can tell whether you've been engaged in frivolous or you've been the victim of frivolous speech, is that you feel tired afterwards. I'm so glad I'm out of the hairdressers. Or the barbers. Sometimes the barbers are chatty. Yeah, so you can. One of the marks of right speech is that you feel energized by it. It made you think, focus, restores you to energy. So that's a good sign that there was something of benefit in that speech. So that is right speech. And right action, non-killing, non-stealing, no sexual misconduct, and right speech is in the previous category. So there's only 3 of those right action. Anything missing? Anything missing? Glaring omission in that? Not killing, not stealing. It sounds like the precepts, doesn't it? Not killing, not stealing, no sexual misconduct, no false speech, no yeah, right. Where's the intoxication thing in the Eightfold Path? It's not there. And you do find it listed as 4, the precepts as 4. In quite a few of the suttas, it's just non-killing, non-stealing, no sexual misconduct, no false speech or lying. And the intoxicant one is gone. But it's taken care of under, because it's not just a reference to, in the precepts you see a reference to intoxicants that cause negligence. So what is this negligence, this pamada? It is what's advocated in both right effort and under right mindfulness, is not non-negligence. And sometimes that's the last word of the Buddha, work out your salvation with diligence. Sometimes but sometimes also with non-negligence, clarity. You're working out your own salvation has to be done with clarity. You can't be negligent in this. That, you don't know how much time you have, so you have to be diligent and lucid. You can't afford, it's hard enough without being intoxicated. So then you can sort of establish, well, what kind of substances cause that lapse of good judgment, clarity, and so forth. Lots of people have rationalizations for their things. Sometimes I think about it as that taking intoxicants is a form of brain surgery, non-invasive. But if you had to go in for brain surgery, and the surgeon said, "Do you mind if I drink while I do this operation?" Drink what? Well, I like beer. I mean, it relaxes me. It relaxes me. No, don't you dare. How about a cup of tea? Okay, the cup of tea. This is a 6-hour brain operation. Yeah, have a cup of tea. Marijuana? No marijuana. By the way, I did, and some of you might be in the medical thing. This is a long time ago. I don't know how long, 35 years ago. No, 40 years maybe. So there's some nurse that was working in the heart specialist OR. And she said, "We're smoking dope all the time in there. They're long operations. Yeah, we're smoking dope in there." Really? Huh. So anyway, I mean, okay, maybe with a heart operation, but not a brain operation. You see, they're leaving things inside and stuff like that. Like, I don't know, but I don't want anybody operating on my brain intoxicated. So I don't want. So in fact, you're operating on your own brain. This practice, this waking up and so forth takes everything you have. You need every ounce of clarity that you have to do this. So that's what the Buddha is saying. It's just not a good idea. You're losing IQ points, and you don't know you're losing IQ. Quite often, they do all these tests. They get race car drivers to drive on two glasses of wine, and they think they did fine, and actually the results are that they didn't do fine at all. So this is the essence of the non-intoxication, is you want to be on your best game, the brightest, clearest that you can be. So yes, killing, of course, it's not universally accepted in society. There's all kinds of... Canada, I think, abolished capital punishment in about I think the last capital punishment was in the mid-60s. It's been off the books since about 1968. And the US never did, or many of the states never did. Some of the countries, no capital punishment, others, capital punishment. Strangely, quite often the Buddhist countries have capital punishment. Thailand has capital punishment. This is a lapse of consistency. There's all kinds of situations, including euthanasia. So that's a big issue, which, for instance, it's once that boundary has gone down, then a lot of people think, well, why shouldn't I just, as soon as I should, if I'm sick, I should just terminate it right now. And then I won't suffer. So the idea is that death ends suffering. But that is not a Buddhist idea, because right view has the idea that there is continuation. So also, if you examine it closely, the idea that death relieves suffering is not because it's the end. So it's like you're unplugging a machine, it's the end. It's an annihilationist idea that death is annihilation, there is no next life or anything like that, so the suffering ends. But there's a lack of reasoning there, because the person who is, if death is the end, the person doesn't experience the cessation of suffering, because there is no experience. So you don't relieve the suffering by dying. You suffer, period. And to experience non-suffering means you have to be alive. You have to be existing to experience non-suffering. So if you have an annihilationist idea, death doesn't relieve suffering. You need to exist to feel the relief of suffering. So you don't get out of it by dying. You just suffer, and that's all. Whatever is happening while you exist is all that happens. And you don't get anything, you don't get relief by not existing. Because you're not there to know that you're not suffering. Maybe other people are not suffering. Now that you're not suffering, you're dead, so now I'm not suffering because you were suffering. So maybe you're putting other people out of their suffering, and they can be out of it because they're around to experience non-suffering, but you can't be. And of course, that leads also into why wait till you're ill? Just why bother to exist when you're ill? Why not just do it when you're just about to get ill? You're still reasonably healthy, so let's move it ahead so you don't have to go through the difficulties. So the Buddha is quite adamant about this. Don't do that to yourself. Don't intentionally. Killing is for other beings and for yourself. Don't do it. Reduction of suffering is fine. Medicine, not pain, deep pain relief and all that kind of stuff, good, Even if it, perhaps, you would live less time because of heavy painkillers and so forth. That's not you're not aspiring to die. You're not thinking, with this, I will die. No, with this, I will reduce my pain. That you can experience. You can't experience the reduction of pain because you're still conscious, existing. So this is something that has to be, you have to think about it ahead of time, because you get a little call from the hospital and you're suddenly in the middle of something, and quite often it's with, family members and so forth, and they want to know whether to pull the plug and all that kind of stuff, or, You have to kind of clarify this ahead of time. They want you to sign these things a lot about non-resuscitation and all that kind of stuff, but most people really haven't thought through it, So you should think through these things. Stealing, of course. This involves even the very small things, like taking a few extra pens home from work or something like that, And mostly it's because you don't want you to have too much concern over getting things. It reduces the dignity of your life. So it's beneath your dignity to do things like that. To take what is not yours, to take property is beneath your dignity. You don't live at a dignified level then. Even if nobody's going to notice the pens, that you're working for the IBM or whatever, and people think like that. But the Buddha is encouraging you to think in a very lofty way, to raise the dignity of your life, so that these things are beneath your dignity. This is a way of uplifting your life rather than just restricting you. And sexual misconduct, we'll talk about that tomorrow. Just kidding. That's wild every now in the world. It's wildly out of control and highly confused. Buddhism, though, is not Christianity. As I understand it, Christians are supposed to get married to one person for life. That's Christianity. And it's a sacrament as well, whereas in Buddhism, it's not a sacrament. It's a social arrangement. And the motivations are, the Buddha says, well, what kind of reasons would one get into an intimate relationship? He says, only for the sake of mutual affection, because you like each other. Brilliant. Of course, lots of cultures have arranged marriages. There's all kinds of other reasons for marriage and so forth, duty and obligation and all kind of stuff. But it's because you have mutual affection. What a beautiful idea. And there's a fair variety of possibilities of these relationships. The Buddha just says it's not a religious thing. We don't perform. Monks are forbidden from arranging a relationship between men and women. So we don't do marriages. We're not we sometimes go to weddings and people offer food. It's the first act of the bride and groom's is an act of generosity to a monk, feeding a monk. Here you go, feed a homeless person. What a nice thing. Together, first act of your mutual affection, you decide and announce to the community that you're going to, we're a couple now. By the way, there's no like, for the rest of our lives. That's not the clause. It's just an announcement, and most societies have like, if you're going to be a couple, let's make it public, you know. And then let's feed a homeless person. What a beautiful act of generosity. We're going to feed a monk. That's nice, and it's a kind of a communion of like, okay, here's our values, you know, and this is generosity. So I've been invited to several weddings and so forth, and that's kind of beautiful. Bride and groom come over and they kneel down to offer this. This is a beautiful thing. But there's not much for the Buddha arranging these kind of things and making laws and all kind of stuff. It's up to you, you know. And if it's not working out, you know, mutual affection is gone. I mean, there's not much reason to continue on. So there's no prohibition about separation. It's mostly about being honest and having some clarity, because these kind of relationships between men and women are very important to them. It can be very hurtful of people's feelings if you make an arrangement and then you don't, you know, but the Buddha doesn't tell you what arrangement you're going to make, so there is, it's not just one man, one woman necessarily. It depends on the social conventions around how the society does it. There's a variety of relationships and so forth. So Buddhism has never had too much trouble dealing with the new things, but he's warning against a lack of integrity in relationships. So you got to be honest. You know, if this is a committed relation. Are we committed here? I mean, you don't have to be committed. I mean, I think he'd be okay if you we're not in a exclusive relationship. Okay, that's whatever. Maybe if that's acceptable to the social structure, then fine. But you gotta be clear about that. Can't step across those. So lying comes into it, lack of integrity. So it's really about like dishonesty and kind of thing. Integrity rather than, it's not much to do with sex at all. There's no discussion. The Buddha does not talk about sexuality at all. Doesn't give any proscriptions about this kind of sex or that kind of sex at all. It's just like whatever. He's very dismissive of the whole idea. He calls it the vulgar practices of the village people. That's all he says about it. He's out of the game, you know. Of course, he's been there, done that. Obviously, he had a wife and he had a child. So there's only one way that happens. So, I mean, he's chosen to withdraw from that. He doesn't try to tell people what to do or anything like that. It's up to them. There's many of these social issues that were really hard for Christianity to process have not been a problem for Buddhism. It's just like, whatever, you know. I don't want to think about it, so. It's liberal is what it is. It's very easy to, it's not, there's no rigid set of structures, but be nice to each other. Hopefully you're friends and affectionate to each other, treat each other nicely. I mean, he goes into great detail about treating each other nicely and taking care of your kids and making a livelihood and teaching your kids and giving gifts to each other, you know, man and woman giving gifts. Of course, give to their friends as well, your generosity. And this is all nice behavior. But no Doesn't want to get into your private life. It's just up to you. And to just be forthright and honest about it. That's it.